Hi, listeners. I'm so excited to have not one, but two speakers today that are authors of the groundbreaking new book, The Psychological Safety Playbook for Change Makers, which is a follow-up to their original book, The Psychological Safety Playbook. Minette Norman is an award-winning author, speaker, leadership consultant, and former Silicon Valley software executive that now facilitates sessions all over the world about psychological safety. Her co-author, Karolin Helbig, is also with us, and Karolin's in Germany, also a leadership consultant focused on mindset and emotional intelligence, and has a PhD in human genetics. I'm so excited to talk with you both about the new book. So let's start there, Minette. Why the follow-up book? What did you hear that kind of inspired you to write a part two?
Yeah, it was not in our original plans to write a part two, honestly, because we thought that, the reason we wrote the first book was that there was just a lack of practical information on how to cultivate psychological safety. There was so much great academic research. We were big fans of Amy Edmondson's work, and then we were, as leadership consultants, looking for the how to. So we couldn't find it, and we wrote that, and that book came out in 2023. And we had, as I said, no plans. But then in 2024, we were out on a book tour in Europe and we met with a bunch of Carolyn's clients and some other companies. And we were talking to leaders and we would call them change makers, people who were really trying to change the corporate culture. And they had all read the first book and they said, well, now that we're diving into it, there's more we want to know, and we're hitting some challenges, some roadblocks, some skepticism. We have like layoffs, we have real world pressures. Now what? Like, what's the next step? So Carolyn and I had this debrief after that speaking tour, and we were just like, you know what? I think there's another book here. And we were sitting in a cafe, and Carolyn started writing some notes down based on our conversations, and that became a rough outline for the second book that just came out.
Oh, that's so exciting, Carolyn. Yeah, from your perspective, what warranted the second book?
Yeah, and that's amazing to see. Now remembering back this afternoon sitting in Copenhagen in this nice cafe, we really scribbled what we envisioned as the second book. And now, when we are looking into the second book, it's really exactly this, addressing skepticism. How can we walk the talk and embody psychological safety? How can we bring our teams along? So you will find very practical things, but on a level deeper. So it's not just the basics of how can we as leaders and team members cultivate psychological safety, but how can we really make it part of the culture, part of the DNA of the company, when facing kind of real world challenges and resistance. And again, it's very, very practical. So you will find, for example, exercises you can do with your team. You can find specific prompts you can reflect on to increase self-awareness, for example. Um, so we tried again to make it as practical as possible, and as former readers said, that's really what a signature of our books. It's not no fluff. So again, we tried to
No,
really
there's not a single sentence
incorporate
that
no fluff
is
at all.
just there. Yeah, it's very practical. And I love how it focuses on the five plays. And so this builds off of the original, the Psychological Safety Playbook, which, by the way, I've used since Minette and I had an exchange when the book came out a couple years ago. I've used the phrases so much in my training, crediting you, of course. But I find those resonate so much. And what I like about the new book is you kind of took it to a next level. It's like, not just kind of a list of phrases you can say, but it's like, here's an application of when you would use these phrases. And I thought we'd just kind of revisit the plays from the playbook. The first one is communicate courageously, and so we'll dive into each one of these. The second one is master the art of listening, which I think most of us know from Leadership 101 listening, but really focusing on listening. And I know it sounds obvious, but we are not great at doing it, even when we're really focused on doing it. Three, managing your reactions. So emotional intelligence is a great pillar there. Four, risk and failure, which Amy C. Edmondson talks a lot about in her latest work. about what's our mentality around failure and why it's necessary for learning and change. And then my favorite is the last one. This is a bit more systems focused, which Carolyn, as you alluded to, our work is requiring us to embed it so it's not so overt, but very baked into the culture of the organization. And step five, play five rather, is design inclusive rituals. So making these just habits, natural ways of doing work, which I love making inclusion just the default instead of asking for allies to, do all these circus heroics. So Carolyn, let's start with the first one, if that's okay with you. Communicate courageously. I love the facilitation question. So my favorite part of the book, listeners, is if you're a facilitator, a change maker, or just a team leader, project leader, it could be anyone in an organization. You don't need a position, but you can use these questions to guide really cool conversations. If you're looking for material, it's already done for you. So, Carolyn, let's start there with courage. What's that all about?
Yeah, and maybe it's a little bit different than what we usually think of courage. So it's not about the big heroic acts. It's really about the courage to be vulnerable, for example.
Mhm.
Particularly as a leader, that's not easy to do. And it's a little bit against the way leaders were socialized and trained in being a leader. A leader often they think they need to have all the answers, for example. And here it's a lot about, for example, in our first book, asking the question, what am I missing? And really inviting your team to contribute and illuminate your maybe blind spots. And this takes courage because that requires the humbleness of being aware, oh, what I see, what I know might not be all there is. I need others' perspectives to kind of complement the
Mhm.
picture, to have this courage to admit what I'm seeing is not all there is. And in the second book, we explore this a little bit. It's a lot about self awareness, being self aware that this takes courage. I fear and I maybe hesitate, and then overcoming this hurdle and stepping ahead despite of feeling a little bit, it might feel a little bit scary to do this. At
Oh,
least first time you are doing this as a
it
leader.
probably should if you're doing real courage. Fear is scary
Yeah,
leading into
exactly.
it. I know. I love that what am I missing question. I don't know. What do you think
Hmm.
question from the book. And that's something, when I'm in the classroom with my students, as much as I support psychological safety, modeling that is really darn hard in real
Mhm.
practice. I mean, it's kind of like a scary, I'm supposed to be the expert, I'm supposed to know about all these things. And there's no way we can as one human being. That's why we have other human beings and we have team members. So it really is this weird like perception that leaders have to have all the answers, which in fact, curious leaders, courageous leaders that lead with vulnerability know they don't have all the answers and seek them out from others. And Minette, I know that kind of dovetails into the second play with listening. I'd love for you to focus on like, how can we I think this is a real conundrum in facilitation. It's like we talk to people about listening, but then we're facilitating and we're talking. I always struggle with this. So, like, how do you facilitate a focus on listening? There's some really great strategies in the second book.
Yeah, and it's such a critical skill. And as you said, it sounds so obvious that we all know how to do it. And you also said it is so darn hard, right? It really is. And we often think we're listening when we're not. And so, we see it as a real practice. And, because both of us are facilitators too, we facilitate programs all the time. One of the things that we have learned is that you have to just, I mean, it's a mindset thing also. Like everything else, we have to commit to listening. And even when you are the supposed expert in the room, you're facilitating a class, to be able to really take in the questions, to, ask the what am I missing? And when you get questions that may challenge you and that you may not know the answer to, to really like allow silence. It's an interesting thing that we often, leaders, facilitators, teachers, professors feel often that like we can't have silence. But silence is so powerful that, we're truly there. Maybe we're going to take a little time to respond, which goes into our next play, but really just this, I am here with you. I am hearing you. I care to hear you. And that is part of, you know, none of these plays stand alone. This is one of the things I want to say. Like you saw how naturally the first play moves into the second. Listening plays so closely with inclusion and belonging because when we feel heard and seen and valued for who we are, we feel that we are included and we belong in this team. And so listening is your signal to people that you care enough about them, that they are valued, that they are an important member of this organization or this class. So we're doing a lot of things when we're listening besides just, opening our ears. And we, in the book, we have some things about, some of the skepticism we get about listening, which is we do not have time for this. In the real world, we have work to do. We don't have time to hear from everyone around the table. And so, we offer strategies, very practical facilitation strategies of like, how can you hear from everyone? How can you listen to everyone in a time effective way? And we have techniques for that because what we know is it is worth hearing from everyone because everyone in your team has something to contribute. They're all different. They see the world differently. And we have to find ways to hear the quiet voices, all the voices. And so that's a lot of what's in this book is like, how do we truly listen to understand and to get the best out of our group of people who do not think alike?
And I think sometimes the danger, in addition to we don't have enough time for this, is that someone's going to go rogue on you. If you ask
Mhm.
an open-ended question, people are going to like go off the guardrails and just bring up something that has nothing to do with what you're talking about or something like that's really inappropriate. And as seasoned facilitators, I'm sure you've had that happen. I know I've had that happen, and you gotta rein people
Yes.
in. But it's very not as common as one would think. And I like the phrase that you have an acronym in the book, ELMO, for when this happens. How do you handle those moments where we're listening, we're opening up the container, and something maybe goes awry? How do you handle that real time?
It's one of the things Carolyn and so we facilitate a program together to train other people in our materials. And so we've had lots of experience with this. And it's often, as you said, it's not always that someone's going rogue and saying something wildly inappropriate. You have
Right.
to shut that down and like, we're not, that's not appropriate or whatever. But that's not usually what happens. What usually happens is you get a very enthusiastic participant who has lots to say and maybe not so much self-awareness of how much airtime they're taking. And so Elmo, which stands for Enough, Let's Move On, that's one of our there's Carolyn has the Elmo doll. But
I love things like that though. I used to do
it
like
makes
an
people
elephant
laugh, right?
exercise for emotions and people like one of my teams got an elephant and they would throw it around the office when someone had a big emotional moment. Like Elmo's a great fun signal that we don't have to have this awkward conversation like we have to
Yeah,
move on now. It's just a fun
exactly. Yeah.
symbol.
And one of the things that we when we're together, it's good cop, bad cop, and I'm the bad cop. So I'm the one who usually stops the people who go on too long. And one of the things is to set expectations. So what we do in our classes, we say, look, we want to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. And if someone is going on for a little bit too long, what I'm going to do is I'm going to interrupt you, and I'm going to do it with a smile on my face. I'm going to use, for example, I'm going to use the timeout signal. That's one way to do it, or the Elmo doll, whatever. And I'm just going to politely interrupt you so we can hear someone else. And I do that
Mhm.
regularly. And people get used to it and it doesn't feel embarrassing after a while. It's just like, this is what we do, right? And Carolyn likes less to do it, but she's also gotten good at doing
I'm
it.
learning.
I'm like you, Carolyn. It's like I don't want to hurt someone's feelings. Like, what if they get upset with me? But then everyone else is going to be upset, is what I remind myself of. Like, this is my job to rein in the conversation and make sure everyone benefits from it, not just the one person. One of my classes, I have some feedback that there was someone in the class that was a pontificator.
Mhm.
And listeners, if you've ever encountered said person, it's like all these thoughts, but like not a lot of like evidence to back it up or like meaningful contribution to take the class forward. And so it really took me a few classes to be able to rein that individual in for the benefit of everyone else. And once I realized it was affecting everyone else, it gave me more the courage, back to the other play, to speak up and to say something and model that for the rest of the group as well. So I love Elmo and the tools there. Also, like some really great facilitation prompts that you offer in this book. So, again, if you're a facilitator that's facilitated psychological safety, I have a basic course that I teach that's maybe an hour, will change a little bit. And I facilitated probably 50, 60 times with mostly corporate clients and in the classroom. And I think what I've struggled with is like how to make it really practical for folks. And I love, if you had the opportunity to have a series or a half day offsite and you really wanted to dig into psychological safety, like the content in the book can really help you do that. So the third play is around reactions and emotional intelligence. And one of the prompts I kind of highlighted, Carolyn, I love like your take on like some good prompts around emotions. And I like the hot button exercise, like what tends to push my hot buttons. Tell us more about how that works real time.
Yeah, we love that exercise too, and we did this with in many workshops with leaders, with clients, with team members, and it's so helpful to have everyone reflect on what actually pushes my hot buttons, and everyone gets triggered, and it's something where leaders often lack self-awareness. They lack the self-awareness that what is regularly triggering myself. And then we not only look at what actually is it, situation, people, whatever that triggers my defensive reaction or fight, flight, fear, freeze reaction. We also spend a lot of time looking at the physical signs, because the physical signs can really serve as a kind of early warning system. So once you get aware of what's triggering me, and especially how is my body reacting, so you can feel before it's full-blown reaction that suddenly maybe your face is blushing, or maybe your heartbeat is accelerating, and your body is giving you signals. And if you pay attention to these signals, you can kind of step out of this fight, flight, freeze reaction before it really is happening. And you can limit the negative consequences which would happen if you just, I don't know, lash out, for example, or show fully your frustration about a mistake or a failure that happened. And that's also something we elaborate in the book, that psychological safety is really slow to build and quick to break. And if you can avoid these breaks in psychological safety by becoming more aware of your reactions and handling them then more skillfully, introducing this pause between trigger and response, for example, then a lot is gained in terms of psychological safety. So paying attention to triggers and tells. And what is really interesting, people might be very different in terms of what is triggering, in terms of what exactly are the hot buttons. However, they discover, oh, we all share more or less the bodily signals. And we can increase our self-awareness about those and become more skillful in navigating these challenging situations.
I love that. Yeah, it's similar exercise that I've done over the years, and it's so insightful for teams, especially ones that have worked together for a long time that may just not even pick up on these cues because you're just so used to the person. I did this once with a leader and his team, and he shared that one of his triggers was when people were late. And like, I looked around the room and everyone's like, oh, shoot, like, I have been late a lot, And like, he sees it as a sign of disrespect and gets really angry. And you can only imagine how that meeting goes, right? And then someone else was, well, when I feel rushed. And so it was like kind of counterintuitive to his. And it's like, huh. But to your point, the physical cues, the heart racing, I get really sweaty and flushed, most people share kind of these, the cortisol's kicking in and sending a stress signal to our body kind of thing. So those are more universal, but what flips that trigger is usually more specific. I mean, of course, there's kind of a basket of ones that tend to elicit a response for most people, but it's very unique. Someone's a minute or two late, that doesn't really bother me, but for somebody else, it's like, yeah, like a sign of disrespect. So it's just interesting how people have different perceptions about the same potential situation. Minette, I wanted to pivot to you on the next play. So how we accept failure. And I find this to be incredibly interesting. Like, how teams embrace or shun mistakes and failure. Tell us more about how to facilitate that, like how to pull that out of folks. Because I think most teams are like, oh, sure, we're good with failure. But this is another one like listening that isn't actual in practice as much as people think.
Right. And we have often polled our clients like what's the most difficult of the plays? And usually what we hear is that managing our reactions is the hardest for people because it's like really going against our biology, right? And the second one that people struggle the most with is, embracing risk and failure because so much in the corporate world, in the professional world in general, we have to succeed. We have to hit our numbers. We have to deliver our products or whatever it is. And so there's this feeling that failure is not even an option. And what happens so much is that because people are afraid of losing their jobs and they think that failing means I lose my job and therefore I have to hide anything that I'm not doing perfectly. And so, one of the things that we really talk about is, of course, whoever is the most senior person in the room is going to have to be probably the first to admit that they have failed and that they have made mistakes because otherwise it's not going to give permission to anyone else to do that. And so, one recommendation is that we talk regularly, like as much as we talk about things that have gone well, that we talk as just as much about things that have not gone well, not to shame or to blame, but to learn. And that's the whole essence of why we need to embrace risk and failure is to do better. It's not that we love failure, it's that if we're trying something new, and certainly if we're trying to innovate, there will be failure along the way. There is no way you can do something that's never been done before without experiencing setbacks. And so the question is, how quickly can we learn from them and improve and move forward? And that's a lot of, you mentioned Amy Edmondson's latest book on failure, really right kind of wrong, talking about intelligent failures, which is really about like when we're trying something hard, challenging, new, of course we will fail. And then the thing that we always have to clear up is that does not mean that we want to tolerate stupid mistakes that were preventable, right? It's not like it's not anything goes. It's really like, let's put all the systems in place to avoid silly mistakes. Like, let's have checklists, let's have procedures so that we can eliminate human error as much as possible. And when we're doing something new, how are we going to learn as we go and not have it be a finger pointing exercise, but instead of like, how fascinating, this didn't go as we predicted. What do we learn? What do we do differently? And that's how you get high performing learning organizations. And it usually starts with the most senior person who has to step into a little bit of vulnerability there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I've facilitated sessions where the senior person is sitting on their hands or not engaged and doesn't share, and like the rest of the team's like they'll admit something like very trivial or silly, like I made a typo in an email, and
Right.
it's like that's not what we're talking about here, right? And so,
Yeah, exactly.
and that's a
Yeah. And it has to be
sign that.
something kind of like a bad decision. Like I made the wrong decision and then I got new data and then I moved forward and I changed my mind. And like many people would think that's a weakness. That's actually a strength, right? So it has to be
Mhm.
substantive to your point. Yeah.
Totally, totally. And that modeling, so much of this content is modeling as leaders and giving permission for the rest of the team to embrace these tools because they're intuitive and I think they're we should be doing these things, but are we actually doing them is the hard part. And so to wrap up on the last play with inclusive rituals, I love this idea of inclusion boosters. So at the end of the book, And each chapter has like a great kind of facilitation framework that you could use real life with your team or as a facilitator. But these inclusion boosters are really fun. And I'll just read off a couple of them. And I'd love, Carolyn, for you to help us understand how organizations could use these, how leaders could use these. But you can include an inclusion booster in a way that kind of feels natural, is what you say. So, what types of interruptions occur in our meetings? How do we handle them? How can we balance structured turn taking with flexibility for brainstorming? How can we ensure that we recognize and appreciate visible contributions or behind the scenes efforts, which we know usually falls on historically marginalized groups? How might we easily gather confidential feedback? Carolyn, tell us more about these inclusion boosters and how to operationalize them.
Yeah, I love that, and it's going back to what you discussed at the very beginning with Minette. We really recommend someone who is facilitating. So inclusion booster is just kind of a moderator, a facilitator of a meeting, because as you said earlier, meetings by default are not inclusive. So we need to design them for inclusion. We need to make sure that we hear from everyone. And the idea of inclusion booster is just to have a rotating role of somebody in facilitating the meeting and paying attention that we actually behave in the way we earlier defined. And that's also an exercise in the book. We often invite teams or groups to first of all define how do we want to interact, to kind of come up with a team charter. And we don't kind of prescribe what that team charter should be. We give some ideas, like, for example, let's hear from everyone before we hear someone twice, for example, or no interruption, or everyone equal airtime, things like that. But teams should go ahead and spend some time to think about how do we really want to interact? What's a good meeting? How can we kind of, what is our ideal meeting type? And what do we want to do? What do we don't want to do? And then the role of the inclusion booster would be to pay attention if those agreements are really lived by and really put into practice. And for example, I don't know, raise the ammo bucket or whatever to signal, hey, we agreed first of all to hear from everyone. We have not yet done so. There is someone who has not yet spoken. Let's invite and hear from them first of all. And the point we stress is that the inclusion booster should be a rotating role. So not a single person doing it every time, because then you raise the awareness. What is actually happening? It can be so eye-opening for people to observe what is actually happening in our meetings. Who is taking up all the airtime? Who is interrupting, who is regularly being interrupted, and things like that. And becoming aware of these dynamics is part of kind of the learning journey of a team. So inviting teams to first of all define agreements and then having a rotating role to make sure we really stick to what we agreed upon.
Yeah, those are great ones, great starter ones. And I've heard all sorts of fun ones over the years. People can get really creative with these. And any team, I think, that meets regularly, more than once or twice a month or even twice a month, to have some norms, to have some ground rules, some psychological safety principles, whatever you want to call them, inclusion boosters. Um, and what ends up happening as that person has their radar up for these things and it rotates, they start to like the peer pressure, positive peer pressure starts to naturally kick in so that the leader doesn't have to be the one to call people in, that inclusion booster becomes more like the default behavior because everyone's watching out for it because they've had a turn at it and they know what to look for. So I just love how sustainable that is. Because some of the things that we've recommended over the years, and me in particular with allyship and DEI, it's like requiring somebody to do something so hard. And in the moment, they're like, I know that wasn't right what somebody said, but I didn't know like what to say and I froze and I didn't do anything and now it's gonna be really awkward to go back to them. So that really helps solve that individual heroic problem that we've had. Um, love all this, love how practical you all make. I know psychological safety, so many leaders tell me that like "Ah, I've heard enough about that. Like, yeah, because they've heard the research, the academics, which is wonderful. It's all well researched. But what you all do is really make it practical and actionable. And we know when we take action towards something we're learning to do, that's the most important part of learning and growing is just taking action. So there's plenty of actions in this book. Minette, I'd love for you to tell our listeners how to find your work, how to follow you all, and get more information about your important work.
Yeah, so of course on LinkedIn, Minette Norman, always happy to interact with people. So Carolyn and I have a shared website, and then we each have our own website. So our shared website is the psychologicalsafetyplaybook.com, and you can find all that information there. And then my website is minettenorman.com. Carolyn's is carolinhelbig.com. I also have a book focused on inclusion, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, because I feel one of the things that I think is so important to recognize is that inclusion and psychological safety are intrinsically linked. I don't think you get one without the other. Sort of feel like a foundation of psychological safety can then lead to inclusion and belonging, but you can't really talk about them independently. So I believe deeply in this work and would love to connect with your listeners. Carolyn.
Awesome, Carolyn. Did we miss anything, Carolyn?
Yeah, I'm also on LinkedIn and happy to interact. We really want to kind of create a community of people, change
Mhm.
makers all around the world. And so we regularly post about all these topics, and we are really happy to connect and engage in discussions.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I'm a big fan. I follow both of you all there and such rich content. Thanks so much for your time today. And thanks for the important book. Highly recommend the Psychological Safety Playbook and part two for change makers, listeners. Really important reads.
Thank you, Julie. It was great to talk with you.